I told you it was going to be real, right? So, it was the first time when Jesus came up to the first apostles that he wanted to make disciples, and he was like, cast down your nets. And then Peter was like, yo, I'm a fisherman. Who are you talking to, yo? And he was like, cast down your nets. And then they tried to haul in the fish, and then it like tore open their net, and they were like, well, okay, you're a better fisherman than I am. Okay, what are you about? And they end up following him, and I think that the part that I really, really, really want to hone in on is when Peter looks at Jesus and he's like, Jesus, depart from me, for I am a sinful man. And at that moment, Peter's identity was rooted in sinfulness. And he felt like that disqualified him from being able to come follow Jesus, right? Now, yesterday we heard the gospel of John 21, which is my absolute favorite, because it's connected with the gospel I just talked about, because this is the second time after they had all their public ministry together, all the disciples did their thing, and then Jesus died, resurrected, the greatest love story of all time. But what do you do after that great story? And then Peter was like, hey, let's go back to fishing, because this is all we know. So they go back to going fishing, and I know we heard this yesterday, but I gotta repeat it, because sometimes reminders are more important than lessons. And when he was back there fishing, Jesus came again. And I know Father Ogu talked a lot about that scripture yesterday, so I'm not going to dive into it as much as he did, but there are some things that I really, really want to hone in on again. He said, cast down your nets again. And I think the second part that I really want to talk about is they described the scene when Peter finally came back to Jesus on the shore, and they described the scene when they were cooking the fish with having warm coals. And it's like, why is that important, right? The last time that Peter encountered fire was when he saw Jesus on trial, and when he was described as warming himself with fire next to, I think it was the officers. I also don't read the Bible. And why is that important? I think it's because how many times have we been like Peter in that moment where something just feels so familiar? Right? Where we've been living this faith thing for like maybe a few months, maybe even some of us a few years now, and we fail in some ways again and again, but then Jesus comes and reminds us again and again past his resurrection, right? It's no coincidence that the fire was mentioned, because Jesus intentionally wanted to remind him of the time when he let down Jesus, when he broke his heart. It's no coincidence that he said again, cast down your nets, because he wanted to remind them of when they first said yes. And then he goes ahead and says, do you love me? Yes. Tend my sheep, feed my sheep, take care of my sheep. Follow me. And I think that the last thing I really want to bring up that also gets left in the cracks is they mentioned that the person who even told Peter that it was Jesus on the shore, because they didn't recognize him at first, was John the Beloved. John the Beloved, and I think that that's so important, right? Why? Because it's no coincidence that the beloved Son of God was the first person to recognize the face of Jesus, and I think that that is what God is calling our identity to be rooted in. It's as a beloved son and daughter. So we can be able to have that ability to be able to recognize Jesus even past the resurrection. Uno momento. So where does that bring us, right? So we know that Jesus is good. We know that our identity should be rooted in this thing called being beloved. What the heck does that even mean? And I think it goes back to all of our own stories now. So not like our origin story with Adam and Eve, but like our actual story where we started to come onto earth, right? And I think that we all have a story, and so much of our stories say something about our identity. right? It's part of our identity, but it's not the fullness of our identity. There's a difference. And I think it's really funny how the stories that we cling to right away are either conversion stories where you're like, oh, sick, until you fell in love with God, or B, how people fell in love and got married, right? Because when Tim Reed was there on retreat, I knew that question was going to come up, and they were like, how did you know that he was the one? And then she gave her story. Because we all want to know that, right? It's interesting. There's always conflict. There's so much love. It's always a redemptive story. And I think that in our stories, we always see ourselves as the hero. And I mean, that's kind of how it should be, because I mean, it's not like we can just go outside of our bodies and be like, you know what, I'm going to be Sergio today. I think I'm going to go see how his life is. But I think that sometimes we get so engulfed in our own stories that we forget about this larger story that's going on every second of every day. Because maybe it's true, maybe it is true. Maybe we are the heroes of our own stories, but if you look at life in the context of, say, Sergio, maybe I'm just Olaf in his story, the sidekick who makes him laugh. And you know what, praise God, I can do that for you, bro. And I think that's a really incredible thing, because sometimes God doesn't call us to be Captain America and take up our shield and go whoop spiritual, but sometimes He simply calls us to be Olaf and be the person who makes jokes in someone's life so that they can be able to keep moving forward, because they need to be the one to take up their shield. That's what it means to live in this body of Christ. But whether you're Olaf, whether you're Elsa, or whether you're John McClane, or whoever you want to identify yourself with in all these movies, there is power in who you are. There is power in your stories. And like I said earlier, stories are part of your identity, but they are not the fulfillment and fullness of your identity. The fullness of anyone's identity is revealed in their heart. Always. And it brings up this huge question. Where is your identity rooted in right now? It was a question brought up in a tree, but it needs to be brought up again. Where is your identity truly rooted in right now? And to quote Saint Teresa of Avila, she said, all things must come to the soul from the roots in which they are planted. Where are your roots planted? Are they truly being uplifted and nourished by the Sacred Heart and the sacred water of our beloved Jesus? Or are they being watered by media? Or are they being watered by these temporary things that we allow ourselves to indulge ourselves in? And I think that a really big question is, why are we willing to run to a theater to see the end of this 11-year saga, but we're not willing to run to His Sacred Heart every day for this ongoing eternity? It's a really good question. And I think that that question can reveal the depths of our hearts very deeply. Our stories are a part of His story. And that's what I've really been wanting to get to all this time. Because Christ's identity is also revealed in His heart, in His sacred heart, revealed by the divine mercy, right? And I think a lot of times when we're looking at the face of Jesus, we see His judgment rather than His heart. Right? I think that a lot of times, and I'm very, very guilty of this because I'm a perfectionist, of, man, Jesus, I'm so sorry, I should be doing this, I'm sorry I didn't do that. Jesus, please don't judge me for this time that I sinned, because I think I'm better than that. Jesus, I'm so sorry I got angry, please don't look at me just like that. But He doesn't do that. In the same way that we are able to see into His heart, He is a seer into our hearts. He doesn't judge based off just our actions, but He judges us based off of our hearts, of our true identity, in which it is rooted. There's no picture of Him closing His heart with a hammer that says, be careful, called divine justice. No. He has an open heart, vulnerable, and it's called divine mercy with the words, Jesus, I trust in you. Jesus, I trust in you. We need to transfer from this mentality of having a white knuckle faith. And what that is what do you do when you're gripping something so hard for a really long time? Your knuckles become white. There's no freedom in having a white knuckle faith because you're stuck. He's calling us to let go and be free with the Spirit. That's the God we're in love with. We have this gigantic privilege of being in love with the God of a broken heart, broken from original sin. And we love him most when we trust him most. Why? Because if you remember from earlier, original sin is rooted in what? Mistrust. So every time we trust Jesus, Jesus, I trust in you, we have this beautiful, beautiful privilege of being able to console his sacred heart. Every time. Why should we do that? We just had a retreat about love. And the greatest commandment is to love him and to love others. And I think sometimes we get really caught up loving others and not him. And I think it's time for us to step up as beloved sons and daughters of God to recognize our identity. To be beloved means to be fully loved. To allow ourselves to be fully loved. To give back that love he gave to us back to him so that he could receive the love he gave us in this internal exchange. And why should we console his heart? Because Jesus is daring, legendary. We have this faith full of legends because we're in love with the God who never died. That's why he's legendary. And in the same way, since we are made to live in his image and likeness, we are called to live legendary lives. To live these lives in which we never die. We are called to be legends, and that is synonymous with sainthood. He wants us to be fully alive on this side of heaven, because the glory of God is man fully alive, and every time that we trust him, every time that we live fully alive, we have this privilege of again and again consoling his sacred heart by living fully alive. Not fully mediocre, but fully alive. And I think the biggest reason why I love John 21 is because it's a story about a choice. Jesus came back, but he didn't have to. And I think that the real choice comes down to Peter when he has the decision of, yes, I will continue your church, or no, I can go back to fishing. And we all just got back from retreat, or at least most of us got back from retreat. And we have this decision to make right now. Are we going to go back? Or are we going to allow this miracle to transform us so that we can be fully alive? Not on our own, but by him. Are we going to go back to that? Are we going to go back to the lives we had before retreat? Are we going to continually go back to the lives we had before our continual conversions? Because we don't have just one conversion story, we have many. This is a life of continual conversions in which God continues and is active and is living in every moment of our lives. There was a moment on retreat when Bishop said that each of the sacraments were a sacrament of love. If a sacrament is an outpouring of God's grace, then every moment is a sacrament. The question is never, Jesus, are you present here? The question is always, are we present to you? Because he's always pursuing us. Are we willing to accept that? And my biggest fear is that we do go back to those lives in which this amazing encounter happens and it didn't matter. I want Jesus to matter, not just for me, but to all of us, because I can't do this alone, none of us can. And one of the biggest things that draws me back here again and again is this organic community that we have that's not perfect, but we can always laugh. We can always share in each other's lives whether or not it's been years or months or I saw you yesterday. We have something very beautiful here, and I can say that because I've been around a little bit, and I've had my heart broken in different kinds of ways, and I know that there's something special here by the grace of God. And I mean that with all my heart and soul. Last things. Here I am talking about telling stories, and I'm not even willing to share part of mine, so here we go. I've been praying a lot on why God wanted me to share part of my heart, and I think it's because He wants me to live out what I'm talking about. And the story that I'm about to tell is very, very personal, and I appreciate you guys for listening. And I do not want this to be about me, but I simply want to tell the story to give God the glory. How did I get here to St. Andrews? Back in 2018, the summer of 2018, I was going through a really rough time because I went through this very difficult breakup, and my great-grandpa passed away at the same time, and my identity was all over the place. I was so lost, and I know that you guys always see me joyful, smiling, laughing, the loudest one in the room. And I'm really glad that you guys get to see this part of me and not that part of me, because that part of me was probably living in the darkest time that I've ever had to live through. It was very difficult, and I remember pleading to God again and again, please give me community. Please, I'm dying. And I have mental health issues, especially with depression and things like that, and it was not easy for me to get out of bed for months. Please do not forgive me because the resurrection part of the story is coming up. And I remember coming to Mass here one day, and John and Abraham they came from Mass, and they came up to me, and they're like, and I was talking to them about community, and they're like, you should come here. This community's great. And I didn't believe it, so I came, and I was proved wrong. Amen. And the reason why I share part of my broken heart is because in the same way that we are in love with the God of the broken heart, I try to emulate His broken heart too in the name of vulnerability, so that His love and the love around me can be poured forth not only to me but to out. I think that that's what it means to live as a beloved. It means to surrender. It's an act of surrender, because a lot of times when we think of surrender, we think about giving up, but it's much more than that. Surrendering is active. It's instead of having this resume faith where we're looking at God and we're looking forward to telling Him all the great things we did for Him. But I think, truthfully, what God is going to ask us at the gates is, who are you? And I think sometimes when I think about living a faith where we're on our knees at the gates, and then there's so many things on our palms that we did for Jesus, right? How can He see our face when we're trying to show Him our merits? I think that God is calling us to live a surrendered life rather than a resume life. Next thing, I was listening to this podcast, and I felt really called to share this. Saint John Paul the Great. There was this priest, and he was walking to go see John Paul the Great for the first time. He's looking around, and he's looking at people's faces, and then he's at these homeless people's faces, and he sees this man that he recognizes. He looks at this man, and he's like, I know you. So he goes up to him, this homeless man, and he's like, what are you doing here? We got ordained as priests. What happened? And he's looking at him, and he can see that he's a very, very broken man, and he tells him he got addicted to drugs, and he lost his weight. And then he's talking to him, and he's like, will you be here tomorrow? I need to go see the freaking Pope, dude. I can't miss that. He's like, there's nowhere else where I could go. So he walks away from him, and he goes to see John Paul, and John Paul's there, and they're having a conversation, and John Paul stops in the middle of their hour appointment, and he says, are you okay? You haven't been paying attention to me very much. And the priest says, I'm so sorry, man. Like, I ran into this fellow priest just now, and my heart is aching. And he's like, bring him here to me tomorrow. So he goes to pick up his homeless priest friend, and then they go tomorrow. And he's like, where are you taking me? He's like, we're going to go see John Paul. And he's like, no. Are you sure, dude? Did you not hear my story? So he brings him in. And then he tells the priest who brought him there, hey, can you give us a few minutes? So after like an hour, he comes out. And his friend is like, what happened? And he says, you know, it was the craziest thing. We were talking. And then after a while, John Paul was like, okay, let me hear your confession. And so he gave his confession. And this is my favorite part. John Paul gets out of his seat and he goes up to this homeless priest who messed up his life. Goes down on his knee, like this, I'm assuming I wasn't there, and says, now you will hear mine. And he says, it was the most humbling confession I had the privilege of hearing. And I think a lot of times when we are living our lives, we forget the beauty of letting ourselves being served. We are Catholics, but we are broken people who need to have the humility to be able to accept the love from God, to be able to give it back to Him. We're human, you need that. And so, last things, I swear this time. God does amazing things through surrendered people. And with that, God does amazing things through surrendered stories. Living as a beloved, to allow ourselves to be loved by God, and to continue to pour that out in our everyday lives, it requires that act of surrender. Are we willing to commit to this life as a beloved? Are we willing to accept that agape love that we talked about all weekend? Are we willing to say yes to this legendary life, because you know legends never die? Or are we going to settle back to the lives of being our versions of a fisherman? The reason why I brought up Endgame earlier is because, you know, there are so many stories that are part of this greater thing, and I wholeheartedly believe that all of us are part of something much greater. Our stories are lining up with His story. That's why it's called history, because it's His story that's happening each second of every day. Are we willing to be active in that? We are part of His endgame. Our lives are the equivalent of part of the gospel. Maybe our lives are an exclamation mark. Maybe our lives, maybe I'm a lowercase m, I don't know. His endgame is everlasting. It never ends. The question He is just pouring forth from the depths of my heart is, yes or no? Thank you guys.